Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. Before we start, here's a strange fact to sit with. The document that runs the United States of America is the oldest written national constitution still in force anywhere in the world. It was actually drafted in 1787, and it's been the supreme law of the land since 1789. And it's still, even now, deciding what the government sitting in Washington can and can't do. So last time I talked about the Declaration of Independence. That document gave America its ideals. Today's document gave it something completely different, a machine for actually governing. And 237 years later, Americans, they're still arguing over both. Here's a question worth sitting with before we get to the history, though. Did the men who wrote this thing back in 1787 actually expect it to be still running the country nearly 247 years later? And I think the answer is more interesting than you'll think, and I'll get to that. But first, we need to understand why a new constitution was needed at all. After independence, the 13 states needed some kind of rule book for how they'd operate together. What they came up with was the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles had one guiding idea behind them. After years of a king telling them what to do, nobody wanted another powerful central government breathing down their necks. So they built a weak one. And I think they built it absolutely on purpose. There was no president, no national court system. Congress couldn't even tax people directly. It could only ask states nicely for money. And states, if they didn't want to pay, could actually just say no, which it turns out a lot of them actually did. So the federal government couldn't regulate trade between states either. So you had states taxing each other's goods like they were foreign countries. And by the mid-1780s, the country was in real trouble. There were debt crises. There was even an armed uprising in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion, which effectively was farmers marching on the courthouse because they were about to lose their land. And the national government essentially couldn't do anything about it because it had no army and no money to raise one. And I think that was the moment when a lot of the founders actually looked at each other and said, this isn't working. How do we make it work? So in the summer of 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia, in the same building where the Declaration had been signed 11 years earlier. Officially, they were only supposed to fix the Articles of Confederation, patch it up if you like. But they didn't patch it up. They actually decided to throw it out and start over. And when you think about it, that was already a quiet act of rebellion against their own instructions. And I think what came out of that room after months of arguing through a brutally hot Philadelphia summer with the windows shut for secrecy was something genuinely new, a plan for a much stronger federal government, one still boxed in by careful limits, because the fear of another tyrant hadn't gone away. But they also weren't willing to accept a government too weak to function either. The whole Constitution is basically an attempt to walk that line. And here's how they chose to open it. Not with a list of grievances like the Declaration of Independence, just 3 words. We the people. That's it. But think about what those 3 words were actually doing. For most of human history, government authority came from a king, or from God speaking through a king or speaking through a pope. This document actually said something completely different right out of the gate. Authority comes from the people themselves, not granted from above, but built from below. And it's easy to read past that opening today because we've heard it 1,000 times. In 1887, it was a genuinely radical claim to put at the top of a founding legal document. So, how do you build your government strong enough to function, but not so strong it turns into exactly the kind of tyranny that you fought a war to escape? The answer was to split power three ways: a legislative branch, Congress, to make the laws, an executive branch, the president, to carry them out, and a judicial branch, the Supreme Court, to interpret them and settle disputes. None of those three branches was ever supposed to be able to just do whatever it wanted. Each one got tools to check the other two. Congress passes the laws, but the president can veto them. The president can also veto a law, but Congress can override that veto. The president appoints judges, but the Senate has to approve them. The courts can actually strike down a law as unconstitutional, but judges themselves only get there through a process Congress and the president both have a hand in. It's a deliberately clunky system, and that clunkiness isn't a design flaw. It's the entire point. The framers had just watched what unchecked power could actually do. They'd rather build something a little slow and a little frustrating than something that could be seized and run by any one person. And this is as important and as pertinent then as it is now. There's a second kind of power baked into the Constitution too. And this one doesn't get talked about as much outside of civics class, but it mattered enormously. But it actually mattered enormously to the states sitting in that room in 1787. And it's called federalism. Instead of putting all authority in Washington or leaving all of it with the states like the failed Articles had actually done, the Constitution actually divides it. So national government handles national matters. States keep authority over their own affairs, and both operate at the same time in the same territory over the same citizens. And I think it was a genuinely awkward compromise to reach. And honestly, arguments over exactly where that line sits between federal power and state power, well, I don't think they've ever really stopped. They were still going on before the ink was dry, and in a lot of ways, they're still going on today. Now, the framers knew they weren't going to get everything right on their first try. So they built in a way to amend the Constitution. But they made that process deliberately hard. An amendment needs broad national agreement, not just a simple majority in one vote somewhere. So how hard is it? Well, since 1787, more than 11,000 amendments have been proposed in Congress. 11,000. Only 27 of them have ever actually made it into the Constitution. That's not a typo, it's by design. The framers didn't want the fundamental rules of government shifting every time political opinion swung one way or another. They wanted something closer to bedrock. Whether that was wise or whether it's aged badly, well, that's a question that I'll come back to because it's right at the center of a lot of modern arguments about this particular document. So the very first changes came almost immediately. In 1791, just a couple of years after the Constitution took effect, the states ratified the first 10 amendments together. We know them today as the Bill of Rights, and they cover most of what Americans instinctively think of when they picture their own freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, the right to assemble, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches, due process, trial by jury, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. And notice something about the list. None of it was actually in the original 1787 document. A lot of states only agreed to ratify the Constitution in the first place because they were promised this list would follow immediately after. Without that promise, I think there's a real argument the Constitution might not have been ratified at all. So of all 27 amendments out of the 11,000, one gets more airtime today than almost any other combined. Can you guess what it is? The Second Amendment. And here's the actual wording, and I think it's worth hearing exactly as it's written, because so much of the argument hangs on these words specifically. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So that sentence has been argued over for more than 2 centuries now, and the argument really comes down to one simple question. Is that opening clause about a militia doing real work, meaning that the right is tied to organized state defense? Or is the right to bear arms an individual one, separate from any militia service at all? Reasonable, serious people land on completely different sides of that question. And I have to say, it's not a debate this podcast is going to settle for you today. Here's a much darker part of the story, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than skated past. The Constitution, as originally written, tolerated slavery. It never actually used the word slave anywhere in the text. The framers were very careful about that, and I think they were almost squeamish about it. But underneath the careful language, there was a real provision protecting the institution, including one that counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in Congress, which I think is absolutely worth pausing on, because what it did was actually gave slaveholding states more political power in Washington and not less. Those provisions didn't get fixed by some later reinterpretation or a clever legal argument. It took a civil war and 3 constitutional amendments afterwards, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, to effectively overturn them. That's not a footnote to the Constitution's story. It's one of the central facts about it. A document built around the idea that all men are created equal spent its first 80 years accommodating an institution that made a mockery of exactly that phrase. And I think one more piece worth understanding before we get to the modern arguments, the Constitution doesn't come with an instruction manual. Someone actually has to decide what its words actually mean when a real dispute lands in court. And that job, folks, ends up falling to the Supreme Court. In 1803, a case called Marbury versus Madison established something called judicial review, the authority of the Supreme Court to strike down laws that violate the Constitution. That case isn't in the original text at all. The court essentially claimed that power for itself, and nobody seriously challenged it. And it's been the bedrock of how American law works ever since, which means in practice, 9 unelected judges get the final word on what a document written in 1787 actually requires of a government in the 21st century. And here's something that tends to surprise people when they hear it. For a document that carries this much weight, the original Constitution is short. It's about 45,000 words. That's it. Shorter than most magazine feature articles. Some national constitutions written since actually run into hundreds of pages, packed with very specific policy detail. The American one deliberately stayed lean, setting out structure and I think also principle rather than trying to answer every question in advance. That brevity, I think, is also why it had to keep being reinterpreted. A short document leaves a lot of blank space, and other branches of government, and the courts especially, have spent 2 centuries trying to fill that space in when arguments occur. And of course, the structure didn't stay inside America's borders either. Written constitutional government, separation of powers, judicial independence, those ideas largely worked out in that hot room in Philadelphia in 1787, ended up echoed in constitutions drafted decades and even centuries later on continents nobody in that room had ever visited. Whatever else you think about the American Constitution, it became one of the most copied political documents in modern history. By now, you can probably tell this thing became something bigger than its own text. For a lot of Americans, the Constitution isn't really experienced as a legal document at all. It functions more like a national symbol, a shared statement of identity, in something the same way the Declaration of Independence works as a statement of the country's founding ideals. People who have never read a single clause of it will still invoke it in an argument because it's become shorthand for what America is supposed to be. Which brings me back to that question from the very start of this episode. Did the framers themselves actually expect this document to be running the country nearly 240 years later? And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. And as it turns out, two of the most important men in that story had sharply different answers. In the autumn of 1789, Thomas Jefferson was in Paris, watching the revolution break out in France in real time. And he sat down and wrote a letter to his friend James Madison that laid out one of the boldest ideas either man ever put on paper. Jefferson's argument went something like this: the earth belongs to the living, not to the dead. No generation has the right to bind the next one to laws, debts, or constitutions it never agreed to. And since, by his own calculation of life expectancy at the time, the majority of any adult population wouldn't still be alive past about 19 years. That was the natural lifespan of any constitution. Every 19 years, Jefferson argued, a constitution should simply expire and the living generation should be free to write a new one from scratch. Now, let me just clarify that. Jefferson wasn't saying that people only lived to 19 years old. Rather, he calculated, using demographic data available to him, that after about 19 years, a majority of the adults who had originally consented to a constitution would have died. Therefore, the political authority derived from their consent had effectively expired. Okay? So think about how radical that actually is. Jefferson wasn't talking about occasional amendments, here and there. He was actually proposing that the Constitution and every law under it should automatically dissolve roughly every generation, forcing each new group of Americans to rebuild the whole system for themselves. Madison's reply is one of the great quiet takedowns, I think, in American political correspondence. He didn't dismiss Jefferson outright because he respected him too much for that, and he took the argument seriously enough to work through it point by point. But his core objection was practical rather than philosophical. Society isn't actually made of neat 19-year generations that, all show up and disappear together, he pointed out. People are born and die on staggered timelines, all the time, overlapping constantly. So effectively, there's no clean moment when one generation ends and the next one starts afresh. And beyond that, Madison argued, improvements made by one generation, roads built, institutions established, debts incurred for genuinely good reason, well, they actually form something like inheritance. Refusing to honor any of it, he wrote, would actually be a debt against the living who take the benefit of it, not a favor to them. Constant refounding, in Madison's view, wouldn't produce more freedom. It would mainly produce instability. And instability, that's exactly the disease the Constitution had been built to cure in the first place. coming as it did right after the chaos of the Articles of Confederation. And I think what's interesting about that is that neither man really budged, at least not on paper. But history quietly settled the argument for them. Madison's version won, and nearly 240 years on, America is still governed under the same 1789 document, patched here and there through 27 amendments, rather than rewritten wholesale every generation the way Jefferson imagined. And what's interesting is that this same tension, adaptability against permanence, is really the argument sitting underneath almost every modern conversation about the Constitution, whether people realize it or not. When someone argues today that the Electoral College needs reform, or that the Senate's equal representation for every state feels outdated, or that the lifetime appointments for federal judges gives way too much power to people that nobody actually elected, they're essentially picking up Jefferson's side of the argument that he lost in 1789. When someone else answers that the amendment process is very difficult on purpose, or that the judicial independence matters more than responsiveness to whatever's popular this year, they're standing more or less where Madison stood. Even the Second Amendment fight fits inside this same frame. Part of what makes that debate so persistent is a genuinely historical question buried underneath the political one. Does an 18th century sentence about militias, written by men who could never have imagined the world it would eventually be applied to, still mean exactly what it meant in 1791? Well, you would argue no. Or, once it's written into a founding document, keep doing new work as the world around it changes. And that's not really a question with a factual answer. I think it's the Jefferson and Madison debate again, just wearing different clothes. None of this means the Constitution has actually stopped changing. It's been amended 27 times, reinterpreted constantly by the Supreme Court since the Marbury versus Madison case in 1803, and stretched to cover situations the framers never remotely anticipated or could have anticipated. Madison didn't actually win an argument for a frozen document. I think he won an argument for a slow one, changed carefully, changed rarely, but never quite closed off for good. So that raises the question then, did they expect this? Did the framers expect their document to still be governing America nearly 240 years later? And my honest answer is it depends entirely on which framer you ask. Jefferson clearly didn't expect it. And more than that, he didn't think it should happen. He saw permanence itself as a kind of quiet tyranny, the dead governing the living. Madison expected and actively argued for exactly the kind of durability the Constitution has actually shown. He believed a nation needed shared, stable ground to stand on, and that constantly rebuilding that ground from zero would cost far more than it gained. The Constitution that the Americans have today is really Madison's answer, tested by 237 years of amendments, wars, court decisions, and social change, and still standing. Whether that's a triumph of stability or a missed opportunity for renewal, well, that's a question that this podcast isn't going to settle for you. Jefferson and Madison couldn't settle it between themselves, and they were friends, they were allies, and I would argue they were two of the sharpest political minds that America has ever produced. History certainly appears to have sided with Madison, but Jefferson's question, I don't think, ever really went away. America has actually lived under Madison's Constitution for nearly 240 years, but history has a habit of whispering things that we'd rather not hear. And let's face it, no Constitution ever failed because the paper wore out. They fail because faith wears out. And, not all at once, quietly, piece by piece, institution by institution, election by election, judgment by judgment, until one day the words are still there, but the belief that once gave them power has actually gone. And the problems begin when enough people stop believing in the rules, because then the rules stop protecting anyone. Look, I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but when I look at the divisions in America today, I sometimes wonder whether historians, decades from now, will actually look back on these years not as the crisis itself, but as the years when the foundations began to crack, seriously crack. History never announces the end of an age while you're living through it. And I think that's also important to remember. It only tells you afterwards. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.